Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby! And I am your host, Liv. Well, nerds, today is a very special day, a very special episode. You've already seen it in the title, so I won't try to surprise you, but I am so excited to say that today's episode is a conversation I had with author and classicist Natalie Haynes. I have been such a huge fan of hers since I read The Children of Jocasta years ago, and we spoke just this past November to chat about one of her latest books, 1,000 Ships, which comes out next week in North America. 1,000 Ships is a retelling of the stories of the women of the Trojan War. So many amazing and tragic women get a voice that they hadn't had before, and it's truly one of the most beautiful, touching, and funny books I've read in a long time. I can't recommend it more. But if you need more convincing, this episode will surely do it. We spoke about the book and certain women from it who get their voices heard, like Clytemnestra in all her glory, brilliant and cunning Penelope, who isn't quite sure what to make of all these stories she's hearing about her husband's escapades all over the Mediterranean while he's supposedly on his way home. Calliope, the muse those bards call upon whenever they need anything. Eris, even, whose role in the war is expanded upon beautifully. You all know how I feel about Eris. We even chatted a little about that king asshat himself, Theseus. Natalie shares some stories of Pandora from her other new book, Pandora's Jar, and the ways in which some mistranslations have affected this very, very ancient woman's story. I can't tell you enough how fun it was to talk with Natalie Haynes, how much I learned, and what a thrill it was to have her feel so similarly about Theseus. A real vindication. One thing you'll notice is a music cue that transitions the conversation. That's because we chatted about book spoilers that I couldn't resist hearing myself, but I wasn't going to ruin anything for you. So I am so thrilled to say this is episode 109. Calliope is over your shit. The Women of the Trojan War with Natalie Haynes. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for asking me.
Oh, I'm so excited that you're able to, that you said yes. A real thrill. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
To the listeners, I'll just say, welcome Natalie Haynes to the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Good. I'm so glad. You'll have to bear with me. This is sort of a newer thing I'm working on where I actually speak to people on the podcast. I've done it for 3 years of just my own voice alone.
Wow, you're like a stand-up at heart.
It's really, it's been just me in a room for a long time. And now I'm sort of breaking into talking to people that I'm a fan of. And, that breeds a little bit of nerves.
Oh, it'll catch on, I think. Dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're talking today both because you were so wonderful as to agree to it, but also because you have a couple of books released. 1,000 Ships is coming out in North America, and this episode will correspond to that, which is very exciting. And then you have Pandora's Jar recently out in the UK. You've got a lot going on with Greek mythological women. I
know, yeah. And actually, at the time of recording, I also have a play in the West End in London, although it's being shown digitally, based on one of Ovid's Heroines, which is another Greek woman. So, yeah, I'm pretty much hemmed in by them. I'm not quite sure how this has happened, but yeah, in every direction, Greek myth women, many of them armed with axes, are standing watching my every move.
I mean, aren't the best of them. I actually did watch the Jermyn Street Theatre play you're referring to. It was wonderful. I watched all 3 of them last
fantastic.
week.
Thank you.
Yeah. My friend found it and we immediately bought tickets to all 3 and were texting each other manically as we were watching. It was wonderful. They were such interesting adaptations, also different and well thought out. It was beautiful.
It was a really good fun project to be part of. It was so lovely.
I can only imagine. And yours was so interesting because you did Hypsipyle, which then lined right up into Medea. How was it working on that?
Yeah, well, it was kind of great because I didn't want to do women I'd already done in 1,000 Ships, because obviously that's the women of the Trojan War. And so tempting as it was to take back Penelope, I kind of felt like I'd already done Penelope in Ships so sort of thoroughly. I didn't really feel like I'd got much to add. And I didn't want to do Medea because she is my next novel but one. So I thought I should sort of wait for her. So it was really a kind of timing thing. Hypsipyle was in the right time frame for me, and I guess I was in the right time frame for her. So yeah, it's quite strange how you have to make these calls, because I thought, I would definitely do Medea at this, and then I thought, oh no, I need to kind of save my energy there, otherwise, when I come to write her book, I'll have used it all up.
Yeah, or have a different idea of her than you maybe want to use. And Medea is so fascinating in herself. I absolutely, she's one of my favorites by far.
Yeah, but it goes that way sometimes with Clytemnestra, for example, in Ships. I mean, you can tell, I think, that I quite like her, even though she is a murderous psycho. You can tell that as murderous psychos go, she's definitely one of my favorites, certainly within the book. And I loved writing her chapter. It's one of my favorites, if not my favorite, in the whole novel. And then when I wrote her non-fiction chapter in Pandora's Jar, which is a way of looking at the women that we're used to thinking of in fictional terms as, how's their story come to us historically? Has it been retold? Has it been put in art? Has it been? And so by the time I finished doing her chapter, I sort of thought, oh no, I'm actually really sympathetic to her now. And I was like, you've had your time, you've written her now. I was like, I would do her differently now. And I've got no regrets for the way that she is in Ships. I really love her that way. But yeah, I thought, God, if I was writing Clytemnestra again after writing, 10,000 words about her, I would definitely do her differently. So you have got to be kind of careful if you're kind of flipping between fiction and non-fiction, and throwing a little bit of drama in the mix as well, that you don't sort of accidentally break the thing that you're trying to create, I think.
Absolutely. I find that in the way I've told the stories in the podcast, where when I first started, I was just kind of completely doing things at random. I started the podcast in my living room of an apartment with 2 people listening to it, maybe. So it, just sort of whatever I came out with. And I did the story of Medea very early on. And then I learned so much as I've now been doing this for 3 years, and I'm much deeper in my ability to research and the sources I have and everything. So I redid Medea into like a 4-part episode that I'm much more proud of than the tiny thing I did at the beginning, because there's, you just learn so much over time.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly what happens. The more time you spend with them, the more they give you. And so, maybe that's how it should be. Maybe that's how everything is. But it really feels to me like you can, go in further and mine deeper.
Absolutely. And for me too, it's the translations. I unfortunately don't read ancient Greek. That's a goal. But
right. Yeah.
So then you find a new translation and it's like, well, it's like a completely different world you're living in just based on how it was translated. It's all fascinating all the time.
Because it must really affect the way you read it. If you have, I mean, because you're getting somebody else's whole interpretation, aren't you? So,
well, exactly.
And it's only quite recently that women have started publishing or been able to publish translations, because for such a long time it was pretty much only academic men, at a time when there were almost no academic women who ever published anything like that.
Well, and they're so different based on that. Like, I try, if I can get my hands on translations by women, I do. And I think that that's what happened with the Medea, if I'm remembering right. I don't remember offhand who I feel like it might have been Edith Hall.
Oh, she's just wonderful. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And so I discovered that one and then suddenly was like, oh, okay, I'm going to tell this story completely differently than I did before, because how could I not? Well, this sort of jumped around a little bit from my notes here, but since you already mentioned Clytemnestra.
Sorry, I'm a bad influence.
No, it's wonderful. I was hoping this is what would happen anyway, but I have notes in case. But since you mentioned Clytemnestra, I'll just jump straight into what I have written down here about her from 1,000 Ships, because I absolutely loved her in that. I love her as a character because she is murderous,
Yes.
but feels so righteous in it. And so the way you handled that and her relationship with Cassandra really got to me. So do you want to sort of talk a little bit about how you got to that point with her?
Yeah, it was quite a difficult write, because Cassandra has been in the book from almost the beginning, because the book changes point of view a lot of times. I can't remember quite how many, 30 something, I think. And there are a few recurring characters. Penelope is one, Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, is another. And the kind of, it's told in the past tense, but what's basically the present tense of the book, the most recent history of the book, is the story of the Trojan women from the Euripides play Trojan Women. So Cassandra's had a lot of stage time, or book time, page time, by the time we get to her meeting Clytemnestra. And we've had her backstory, which is incredibly brutal. And so I think it's pretty clear that I really like her, that I feel a lot of common values with Cassandra. She has this sort of disconnect from the rest of the world. And, it's because obviously she's a prophetess. But I think that's quite an appropriate metaphor for an artist. It's how it should be. You should be slightly off kilter in some ways if you're trying to create something. And so by the time she meets Clytemnestra, I thought, I've rooted for Cassandra for so long. This is going to be a really strange sort of chapter to write. And actually, it was really easy. I went straight back to Aeschylus, to his play Agamemnon, the first in the Oresteia trilogy. And it is such a remarkable piece of theatre. There are so many moments in it which feel like they're straight out of like a Japanese horror film. Cassandra says she could see black furies dancing on the roof of the house of Atreus. It's like, well, what? It just feels so modern, so terrifying, so, not symbolic, but literal when she says it. And I thought, okay, so this woman who lives here is just kind of a pure distilled rage. And when you go back to the Aeschylus, there are other versions of the Clytemnestra Agamemnon murder, which date to around the same time. Pindar, there's a crater, a wine mixing bowl, I think in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which shows a different version. Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's boyfriend, does the killing in that, for example, and she just sort of stands by as a cheerleader. But in Aeschylus, she absolutely does it herself, and we hear him cry out. Intriguingly, we don't hear Cassandra make a sound, although she knows when she goes into the palace that she's going to be killed because she can see the future. So she's obviously very much more accepting of her death than Agamemnon is, perhaps understandably because she knows it's coming, perhaps incomprehensibly because she knows it's coming. But the Clytemnestra in that play is just an incredibly transgressive figure. There's not much evidence that it was performed again, which most tragedies, especially most successful tragedies, were. And perhaps it was just too alarming for the audience of the time, because she is queen not just because she is married to the absent king, to Agamemnon, but because she has taken political power for herself. The old men of the chorus at the beginning of the play come to her and say, "We come to you honoring your power." The word they use is kratos, from which we get the word, for example, democracy. And so they're not talking about, charisma or influence. They're talking about actual political power. And, she only becomes more ambitious and more deviant in terms of female stereotypes, archetypes, as the play goes on. There's an incredible moment where, having killed Agamemnon, she comes outside, she's completely unapologetic. And the old men say, you've done something terrible. And she says, well, why do you care about his life when you didn't care about Iphigenia's? A question, by the way, which I think is unanswerable. And that's why they don't successfully answer it. And she says, if you've got a problem with me, that's fine, I'll fight you. And she doesn't mean, in a battle of wits. She means actually take them on in combat. It's just incredible. And so that Clytemnestra is the beating heart of her bit of ships. And that may sound like an odd thing to say, given that she doesn't seem to have a heart particularly. But actually, as her chapter in Pandora's Jar shows, she is a woman who's been unbelievably bereaved twice of two children, 16 years apart, by the same man. It's like, you know what? I'm probably not going to tell her she can't do this.
That's the thing about her. I mean, I find her so righteous in everything she does. I mean, it's horrible, but it just feels so right. It feels so good. Also because, I mean, Agamemnon is not the most likable man in any source.
Certainly not when I write him.
I mean, not when I read him either. I mean, the reason I'm drawn so specifically to the fiction you write and the books in general, but is that my whole obsession with this podcast is sort of trying to take back the women of mythology in my very sort of non-academic, but like very researched way. And focusing on the women and their stories in the way that we often don't get them directly from the text. Obviously, it depends what you're reading, but so often they're overshadowed by the men who wrote the things down. And I think it's important to kind of examine how they could be interpreted if you are constantly sort of aware of that aspect. And that's what I love about Clytemnestra, because there's just, I mean, she's righteous. She has such good reasons. Well, I mean, I don't want to necessarily explain away murder, but she understands she has good reasons for what she plans to do, and the way she does it is so epic.
I mean, the thing is, she has perfectly good reasons for murder within the moral code of the time in which she lives. Yes. Right? So, taking revenge for a dead child is a perfectly legitimate reason in Bronze Age Greece for taking someone's life. It obviously isn't now, but that's, one of the things that's extraordinary about the Oresteia is that it kind of maps that moment in human civilization, where we go from like within the family revenge to societal justice. So instead of retributive justice, where you kill the person who's injured you and then their relative kills you in exchange, and then, and it never ends, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the world ends up blind and toothless. It moves to being something which can be settled in the courts of law. Although, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that at that point, women lose all kind of representation themselves, because obviously they're not jurors in ancient Greece. In 5th century Athens, they're not, if they're prosecuted, they're prosecuted kind of via their husband, they're defended via their husband. So they stop having any kind of autonomy. So in lots of ways, it's a fantastic moment that's sort of documented by the Oresteia, this moment where we stop taking revenge and start looking to society to resolve these issues rather than making it personal vengeance. But it sidelines women. It takes justice or retribution out of the household, where women can have some power, and into society, which in 5th century Athens means they have no power at all. So it's an extraordinary play. But it's worth bearing in mind that there are versions of Clytemnestra where she's much less transgressive. When the Romans get hold of her, Ovid, for example, who I know you're a fan of as well.
Absolutely.
But in his version of her, then I can't remember if it's in the Ars Amatoria maybe, I think it's in the Ars Am. He has her as a sort of, she's sort of a neurotic housewife who's been having this affair, and she's worried she's going to get found out. And that's why she's sort of trying to work out how she can, not get caught. And that's how Agamemnon ends up dying. But he ends up, I'm pretty sure in the Ovid, I think he's killed by Aegisthus again. So she loses all this kind of venging fury, mother trying to right the wrongs done to her children. And she becomes, the woman having an affair whose boyfriend kills her husband, which is a much less transgressive version of her, which doesn't mean it's not interesting and not valid, of course. There's no right version of a myth. But I would be lying if I said it was my favorite. My favorite is Aeschylus all day long.
Oh, I agree completely. I mean, there's a lot of interpretations that have Aegisthus killing Agamemnon, or at least much more in control, which is why I mean, I feel like it's most, like you're saying, other than Aeschylus is Agamemnon. But that's what I really enjoyed so much in A Thousand Ships, is that as much as Aegisthus was there, he was very much like, oh, she's had some fun with him, sort of, done whatever she needs to do to take what he has and make sure she's like completely in control of the situation. But he is in it for so little time.
Yeah, he's basically a Hollywood wife from the 1990s, as told by me. His basic role is to go, oh, but be careful. That's it.
Well, and the way she admits that she can enjoy sleeping with him but also just think, oh, he's just kind of there for what I need him for.
Yes, she is absolutely ruthless, my version.
I absolutely loved it. I mean, I have so much trouble often saying it out loud without writing it down first of how I feel about these myths, just because I think they're all so interesting, but I'm constantly learning so much more. And like we were saying with the different versions and translations, just constantly adapting how I see all these. But I just find Clytemnestra particularly fascinating.
Yeah, I agree.
Speaking of the other character you mentioned that gets a recurring role in A Thousand Ships, I have to bring up Calliope. I want to know exactly what drove you to having her just be completely over the poets, still doing her job, but just really sick of their shit.
Yeah, I was really... it's always sort of vaguely annoyed me the way that the Iliad is so routinely translated its first line as "Sing, Muse, of the wrath of Achilles." And, there are variations on a theme, but basically that's what we usually get. Men and wrath is the first word of the poem. But it just, I don't know, that imperative has always slightly got on my wick. It's like, really? Could you say please? Is that an option? And generally, it's quite a good idea to be polite to gods and goddesses in Greek myth. You don't want to go around being, too presumptuous, because generally that counts as hubris, and then you end up in, let's say, euphemistically, a bit of a pickle.
Yeah, there's some trouble from that. There's definitely been some bad results.
So it can sometimes go a little bit poorly for you, yeah. And so I kind of thought, well, how much fun it would be if she was just sort of, not quite marking the time, but if she was there going, well, this is the kind of poem that you should be writing. I'm bored of the kind that you want to do. I've heard about all these men, and I want a story for women. So you can either write that one, buddy, or you can not write one at all. And so she just got crosser and crosser as the book went on, which was always a risk of doing her, I suppose. She just gets more and more kind of snarky. But I think she's the sort of, in some ways, she's the sort of moral core of the book, because she's the one who's always there reminding us, as she reminds the poet who wants to compose an epic poem with her assistants, that these stories need to be told. And I thought, well, yeah, they do. And I wish this didn't need saying, because it's patently obvious to me that these stories need telling, because they haven't been told very often, and certainly not, in any kind of detail for a really long time. And then, she kind of wrote herself, really, because I always felt like the goddesses in the book could have slightly more contemporary kind of feel to their dialogue, because obviously, they don't die, so they're still around now, so they could have much more resonant modern language than the human characters who've sort of who belong in a sort of nebulous past in terms of their voice patterns. But yeah, she was incredibly good fun to write, but annoyingly all her chapters are really short, so I never got to enjoy her very long at a time. They're always like a page at most.
They were such a perfect way to break it up, though. You just to get through her and then get to one of her sections that would just, make you laugh, and then head back into the very tragic lives of the Trojan women. It was nice to have that little breath of entertaining, just a reason to laugh in it.
Yeah, I'm really glad. I thought when I was writing it, I was like, is this going to seem really like tonal lurch? And I've always been really wedded to the idea that there's no reason to separate comedy and tragedy. That's partly because I used to be a stand-up comedian, and now write, pretty sad books. But it's also partly because, I think they're both catharsis, right? Aristotle told us this in the Poetics. They're two different routes to feeling better about ourselves, basically, either by comparing our own lives to those of people in tragedy, generally better, or by, just mocking the lives of people who are worse than us in comedy. And that seemed to me to be a kind of fun thing to do. But I did wonder the whole way through writing it, I was like, are people just going to go, sorry, did you just have this really harrowing scene where this happened? And wait, what? And actually, luckily, other people found the same. I mean, really sad things happen to funny people sometimes. So it seemed not unreasonable to me. But other people don't do it very often, I guess. So maybe it's an unusual choice.
I think it's an interesting way of going about it, though, because Greek mythology is so tragic and so funny. I mean, that's what I love so much about it, is that it is so incredibly entertaining, both, in those two very stark ways, especially the Trojan War. I mean, the Trojan War is particularly tragic more than it is funny, but you still get moments of levity, and I like the idea that it's the muse who's kind of the one who's just sort of making it happen. The muses themselves need more stories in general, I think.
Always. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But yeah, I think you're completely right. There's, the perfect illustration, I think, is in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where he tells the story of Actaeon, which is really brutal. He catches sight of Artemis bathing. He shouldn't have seen it. We don't know whether it's accidental. Ovid has it be accidental or deliberate, that he's just trying to cop a grope or at least a look. And so Artemis turns him into a stag, and he's torn apart by his own hunting hounds. And it is a really, vicious way for someone to die.
It's viscerally told, too. It's very detailed.
Really, really is. I mean, and then there's the things which Ovid does to change the tone and make us kind of aware that there's an element of irony in play. The first is that Artemis is tall, and that's how he gets a look at her, because he can see her sort of head and shoulders above her serving women. And that's such an Ovid thing to do. It's like, well, goddesses are going to be taller than regular people. So you have this idea of her as a beanpole standing over everybody. It's like, well, that is a little bit funny. And the other thing, of course, he does is to list the names of all the dogs, which is, brutal and also funny, because they're all called things like, Gnasher or Whirlwind, or, they're named for being fast or chompy or good at chasing things or whatever. And it's just like, God, that is awful, and yet there's a sort of element of humor in there. And so, yeah, I knew I was following in a noble tradition. It was just a question of how easy it was to maintain, really.
Well, speaking of noble traditions, Penelope.
Love her.
I would love to talk about your take on Penelope, but yes, just Penelope in general. I absolutely love her.
Yes, I agree. She's wonderful. And she's always been treated as this sort of, I mean, there are different traps for women, I think, in terms of the way that they are talked about and written about. And in the case of Penelope, routinely drawn and painted and sculpted. And for the most part, it's, that this woman, Medea, Clytemnestra, is bad. Medea is the worst mother. Clytemnestra is the worst wife. And so we have this notion of them as bad women, and then we know where we are and we can all kind of carry on. And with Penelope, it's the opposite. She's the best wife. She's so good, long-suffering, never complaining Penelope. And there is nothing like that to get my back up. It's like, oh, come on, wait, what? How much of a pedestal do you think this woman should be sitting on, just out of interest? And almost always, when I started to think about it, she's described as the sort of ideal wife by men she doesn't know, who don't know her. Agamemnon in book 24 of the Odyssey says, lucky son of Laertes. He means Odysseus, of course, although he's talking to somebody else in the underworld. He says, lucky son of Laertes to have such a brilliant wife. The gods themselves will create this poem in her honor. Not like my wife. And that right there is what is wrong with this, men think that Penelope is great vibe. Because Agamemnon has at most met Penelope twice, I reckon. Maybe once when he presumably attends the people trying to get married to Helen suitor fest, which is won out by his brother Menelaus. And then perhaps a second time when they go to claim Odysseus for the expedition to Troy. And both of those occasions were at least 20 years ago, because the war is 10 years and it takes Odysseus another 10 years to get home. So someone you met twice 20 years ago, I'm afraid, I don't think gets to tell everybody what kind of person you are. Because do you know what? They have no idea what kind of person you are. He doesn't want to talk about what kind of person Penelope is. He just wants to be able to beat everybody up with how awful his wife was. And this is another way of maneuvering in. And it occurred to me that it is an incredibly misogynistic strategy to have one perfect woman against whom all other women fall short. it seemed to me a bit, you don't very often come across the idea of a perfect man.
Not in mythology.
No, really not in mythology. And so I thought, well, in that case, who's she really going to be? And I had obviously read and loved Margaret Atwood's Penelope, which, tells her in a very kind of Dorothy Parkerish vibe, which I adored. But A, she'd already done it perfectly and there was no point trying to rival it. But also B, this book was set in the past, in the Bronze Age, however much it's written in English and all of those things, all those caveats anyway. I didn't want Penelope to sound as modern in this book because it wouldn't have fitted. And so actually this is Ovid again. It's the first of the Heroides, the first of the letters from heroines to their absent menfolk, is from Penelope to Ulysses, which of course is the Roman name for Odysseus. And I don't think, when I read that for the first time, I don't think I'd ever heard Penelope's side of a story ever, because in the Odyssey, we're always getting other people's, sense of her. We don't get very much of a sense of her. And when we do, we don't know if we're getting her or not. Because, for example, Athene will put an idea into her mind to show herself off to the suitors. And then scholars worldwide for hundreds of years talk very seriously and academically about what kind of person she is, given that she wants to show herself off to the suitors. Well, we have no idea if she wants to show herself off to the suitors. We know that Athene has told her to. That's not the same thing. Is that her idea, or has Athene put that idea into her mind from nowhere? There are times when she's given dreams of her sister, and it's like, well, but what does Penelope dream about when we're not looking? The first time we meet in the Odyssey, first time we meet Penelope in book 1, she's veiled. That's not an accident. She's incredibly enigmatic as characters go. And so I thought, well, it was Ovid really who'd given her, for me anyway, who'd given her a voice of her own, when she turns around and says, that fantastic moment in book 10 of the Iliad, the Dolonaea, where Odysseus and Diomedes, I think, go off on an adventure.
To the Thracians.
Exactly, and eventually they capture the horses of King Rhesus of Thrace. And it's presented as a sort of heroic exploit, understandably, in the Iliad, which is full of heroic exploits. And then Ovid comes along, and that whole sequence is suddenly reduced to, were you ever thinking about me and your son when you did that? And you realize that for the woman waiting at home, the more heroically he behaves, actually the more irresponsible it is from her perspective. And I thought it was just such a brilliant thing to do. She says, it was better for me when Troy was still standing, because at least then I knew where you were and why you weren't here. But it fell 10 years ago. And, eventually it concludes with so much pathos when she says, when you left, I was a young girl. If you came back right now, I'd be an old woman. And you realize that for Penelope, she lost the war. It doesn't matter that Odysseus won it. She spent 20 years waiting for him. Every chance of having more children has been lost to her. She's just had to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for 20 years. And I thought, once I'd read that Ovid letter, I set out expecting with ships to tell the whole story of the Odyssey from the perspectives of different women each time, which is what I was doing with the story of the Trojan War itself and with its aftermath for the Trojans in particular. And I fully intended to do a chapter for Circe and for Calypso. And I mean, Scylla and Charybdis, I was thinking, although how I was going to do the voice of a whirlpool, I can't tell you. But and some barking and then a glug glug sound, I suppose. But then once I'd written the first chapter from Penelope's voice, I thought, oh no, there's no way I'm giving this up. And actually, I think there were so many voices in the book, and not everybody spends all their waking minutes thinking about Greek myth. I think probably it would have been too confusing if I'd done that as well. But yeah, it really was one of those things where I was convinced all these women were going to get a voice, and Penelope pitched up and just went, nope. It's like, okay, you can have it all. Fair enough.
Well, and her voice was so perfect for it too. I mean, the way she was credulous. Oh, you're welcome. I absolutely loved Penelope. The way she was so unsure, the way she was, not certain at all, and just didn't want to didn't want to believe in the story the bards were telling her, but was more like, this is not possible. Like, I mean, what is the likelihood that all of these things have actually befallen you and you're not just, dawdling or stuck somewhere with a woman, which eventually he was.
I mean, that's the thing we often forget about the Odyssey, is it's a 10-year adventure story. It isn't, because actually 8 of those years are spent shacked up with 2 women.
Oh, yeah.
So little bit under 10 years, isn't it? A little bit under 5, a little bit under 3. Do you know, it's 2 years, mate. The rest of the time you are just having, let's say, horizontal adventures and quite safe. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's, the actual adventures don't last that long. And they are, if you're listening to this from the outside, they sound completely unbelievable. I mean, sure, most of mythology does, but even still, the way she listens and says, I heard you ran into a man with one eye who ate your friends. I mean, that just sounds so unlikely. Her whole voice really got me, especially because she was sort of an added level of comedy with not in the same way as Calliope, but in a way that she still was very funny. I mean, especially because I'm such a nerd, and specifically for Penelope and the Odyssey specifically. So reading her sections, I was just, kept laughing out loud.
Good. That was always my goal.
Oh, it absolutely worked, especially for me who truly, I mean, the smile on my face when I read most mythological content, especially fiction, where you kind of get a little bit more than we get in the sources. I absolutely love it.
Well, good. I stitched, what are they called in gaming? Easter eggs into that book all over the place. So if you are a nerd, there are rewards for your nerditude.
Oh, I'm hoping I caught them all.
I really feel confident you did.
I certainly have read a lot over the past couple of years, more than I ever expected to. One thing I did love too is how little the suitors actually played a role.
Yeah, they're just an annoyance, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Just sort of a gnat in the background, just sort of she's swatting them away, but her real concern is the stories she's hearing. And
absolutely. Because I mean, I guess we all read the Odyssey in our own ways, but I have always felt like she might just about have hots for like one of them. And in my version, she has hots for one of them because there is I think it's in, I can't remember, Pseudo Apollodorus's Bibliotheca or something. There's a story about her having a fling with one of them. And already that makes her more interesting, doesn't it? So she's not saintly Penelope, she's sort of racy Penelope. And you go, yeah, why not? But I thought, with the greatest respect, the suitors are absolute idiots. Because, it's like 3 years plus that she's doing that weaving, unweaving thing, and none of them rumbles her. She has to be grassed up by a slave woman to them before they find. And it's like, what? I mean, Odysseus, for his many failings, and, he is really terrible at getting men back to Ithaca, insofar as he fails 100% to get any of his men home again. The only Ithacan who makes it back from the Trojan War alive is him. So, he's not the best hero if you're not him. But I thought, well, at least he's smart. He might make stupid mistakes, like, telling the Cyclops his name. But generally, you can imagine a relationship between the two of them is a relationship between two smart, sort of sneaky people. And the suitors just have no sense of, at least as presented by Homer, don't seem to have any sense of kind of critical inquiry at all. I was like, she might fancy one of them enough for a couple of nights, but there's just no way she's going to think about remarrying one of them because they're all idiots.
Well, and you pointed out too in the book that they're young because they would have been so young that they didn't go to the war.
Right.
So there's all these young guys coming around and she's getting a little older and she just wants her husband back. And it's just like, none of you are worth my time. You're not smart enough. You're all just inexperienced babies who are just eating me out of house and
home. I mean, I think that's it. I think she might have, eyed a couple because, they'd be like 25, something like that, 28. And, she's sort of in her 40s. And you think, yeah, I reckon you would definitely have, got an eyeful. But whether or not you would have wanted to take it any further, I think you'd have liked somebody a little bit brainier.
Well, especially when she had Odysseus, that's what he's known for. Exactly. And they're known for being sort of equals in their intelligence, which is what I love about those two. I mean, as much as Odysseus has major problems, I personally love him. He's definitely one of my favorite of the men as far as, men of ancient Greek mythology go.
Yeah, as far as that sort of thing goes.
Yeah, none of them are particularly great.
That's fair. I mean, I always tell audiences when I'm on stage that the most dangerous place for a woman in Greek myth is anywhere near Theseus. The most dangerous place for a man, anywhere near Odysseus, 100% of the time.
Absolutely.
Just don't go anywhere near him. You cannot survive the journey. Women do quite well, generally, out of Odysseus, but men, not so much.
Oh, and Theseus, my God. Theseus is... I love telling his story because I am entirely okay outwardly hating every single thing about him. And so I know I don't give him a fair shot in the podcast because I don't see how you can. He's just awful.
I mean, he started it. That's the way you
right?
got to look at it.
He's just the worst.
Plutarch calls him out on that. Even Plutarch is there going, yes, he had quite a lot of marriages which started badly and ended badly. And you're like, mate, when you're having shade thrown over you by Plutarch, you have got a problem. That is all I'm saying.
I just don't think there's anything redeeming about him. He's just awful throughout the whole thing.
I agree. I agree.
It's become a running joke in my podcast, and I take that as a real point of pride that I've inflicted that upon so many people who had no idea of mythology before, and now they will come out hating Theseus.
Correct. Brainwashing done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel good about it.
Not all heroes wear capes. Hello.
Well, okay. Oh, one goddess. I mean, I think the way you covered the goddess was really interesting, and I would love to hear kind of how you went about that. But I just have to say how much I love that Eris got a chapter.
Oh, I love Eris. I loved writing her because she's properly stupid and you hardly ever get to write. She just, because her memory is terrible, because I figured, she goes around sowing discord everywhere. And the only way you could really do that is if you were sort of slightly, always in the present. She just doesn't remember anything. The memories just kind of slide away from her really quickly. So she's always there stirring up trouble, but she never really feels responsible for it. And that was, I don't know, I mean, I'd only got one or two vase paintings to choose from. There are so few images of her.
There's so little.
And her look is entirely stolen from that, as is true of almost all of the goddesses and quite a lot of the mortals in ships. Their outfits, their jewelry, nicked entirely from vase paintings, statues, and various other relics in various museums. And so her look was quite easy, but her sort of total incapacity to take responsibility for anything or to even recall that she might was just joyous to write. And I don't even really know why I decided to write her that way. I just thought you couldn't possibly go around. You'd either have to make her sort of so nefarious she would become like a cartoon villain going, how much trouble can I make? And I didn't want to write that because it seemed boring. Or you'd have to have somebody who just genuinely doesn't feel responsible. And there's something intriguing about those people. Or in this case, goddesses. So yeah, that's the way I decided to go for her. And I really enjoyed writing the moments where she causes chaos, and even as it's happening, she doesn't really acknowledge that she's responsible for it. So at one point she gets sort of found out spying on Hera and Zeus because one of her feathers falls down from the roof. And even then she feels sort of vaguely aggrieved but can't quite work out what's happened. Yeah, I loved writing her. I can't lie.
It gave me such a thrill to see her name at the top of a chapter. I've loved her, I mean, since long before I started doing really anything in the mythology. I started writing a novel over 10 years ago and stumbled upon the myths of her and Harmonia and found something that linked them together. There's very little that links them together other than their Roman names, but it just sort of got me going on her, and I just find her so fascinating. There's so little, but like you said, the few vase paintings that there are, I mean, a woman walking around with wearing all black and with black wings alone, I think is just one of the greatest things.
I mean, I've basically dressed like that since I was 16. So I'm absolutely overjoyed by it, to be honest with you. I've been working that 90s goth look for the longest time. So
yeah. The punk in me, I was very much a high school punk, and I just, everything about her, I just one picture with loads of eyeliner and dyed black hair, and
completely reasonable. Yeah,
she's just, I mean, the black wings alone make me happier than anything else. But seeing her in her own chapter, and the questioning of the apple was really interesting.
Oh, good.
The way you kind of expanded upon that. I don't know how much to talk about that because it feels like more of a spoiler than the stuff that's overall the Iliad.
It's really hard, isn't it? Yeah, it's really hard to work out how much you're spoiling people and how much you aren't. I never know what to do, but yeah, you're probably right. And that was one of the easier decisions to make was, why do we have to have this war? And I thought, well, I think the reader is going to want an answer to that. And I wanted an answer to that. And so that's the answer that I went with.
And it turns Eris into a pretty fun pawn, I would say.
Yes, she's an agent of change rather than anything else. Yeah, absolutely.
I've always loved the idea of the golden apple, and so to have it kind of used in that way was particularly powerful, I think.
Yeah, it's fun being able to deconstruct it, isn't it? Because the idea of a golden apple appears in so many of these stories. You know, there's the sort of golden apples of the Hesperides or whatever, you know, the Atalanta story. And you kind of think, well, golden apples they're just MacGuffins, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know, they're a shiny object that somebody wants for no particularly good reason other than that it is shiny. And so it felt like that just wasn't enough in a novel. You know, you can get away with it if I'd been doing a version, you know, a retelling of the myth over a couple of pages, it would have been fine. But when it's holding up the weight of 90,000 words, you need more than that, or at least I felt I needed more than that.
Yeah, well, and then it brings the gods in to things more, which of course, comparatively, the Iliad has more god interactions with humans than a lot of the mythology, in the way they sort of mess with everything and have their own say and who does and does not live. And I mean, that's what I love about the Iliad so much, is how much the gods are involved, and they're very human in the way they're just sort of angry and pissed off with one person or another, protecting one person or another.
Yeah, it's a very interventionist kind of set of deities, isn't it? And then I think that reaches its sort of most perfect iteration in not a Trojan War play, in fact, but in Euripides' Hippolytus, which obviously is bookended by Aphrodite and then Artemis as the most petulant versions of themselves that you could hope to find. You know, they're so petty. It's so trivial, you know, the injury done to Aphrodite. She's being praised, and she gets to torment pretty well every single person alive. And then one kid goes out hunting instead of, you know, staying at home masturbating, which presumably is what she would have preferred. And she decides to destroy an entire household. It's like, what? Really? Are you sure? You know, she begins that play by saying, you know, I punish people who don't honor me, and I reward people who are nice to me. And then goes on to tell us that she's about to destroy Phaedra, who's built an entire temple to her. It's like, you haven't even made it through another 10 lines before you've disproved. You're not nice to anybody. You know, she is terrifying in that version of her. And so I completely based my version of the Olympian gods in particular on that Euripidean kind of vision of them as just being basically pure id, you know, that whatever they want, they'll take. Whatever they want, they see as being morally right, because, you know, they're gods and they want it. So they never have to question anything that they think of or do. And it was quite an interesting experience writing female characters who have no concern for other people's opinions at all, because you realise you don't very often get to write that, you know, because it would seem sort of vaguely unrealistic. So writing goddesses who just don't care was pretty, it was pretty freeing.
Yeah, I bet, especially compared to the other women that you're writing about in this, which are...
Well, yeah, the Trojan women especially have you know, no agency at all, really. You know, they're just their whole existence is dictated by the men who've won the war against their husbands and brothers and sons and fathers. And so this whole decision has been taken out of their hands. And they've got no power at all except enduring what befalls them. So to write the kind of opposite of that, of characters who only have power but have absolutely no concern, it made it a really pleasing alternative viewpoint, I felt.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, we've talked a lot about the women of a thousand ships, mostly talking about that because it comes out in North America as well, which I snuck my copy from the UK because I didn't want to wait. Yeah,
Ships will be out in January, and I'm not sure when Pandora is out, but Pandora will also get her go. So don't worry, they're coming to you.
Good. Well, I've talked about the Children of Jocasta a lot on the podcast, especially just I love all the stories of Thebes that comes along with my fascination with Harmonia as a sort of non-character that's interesting in herself. But that's all to say, you opened and of course titled the book Pandora's Jar with Pandora.
Yes.
So I thought, why don't we sort of finish it off by just talking about Pandora a little bit, sort of that first woman who's kind of wronged by interpretations.
Oh, she really is. My goodness, can there
Mm-hmm.
be anyone who's been less well served by a translation error? I say no. No, there cannot. Because Pandora doesn't have a box, even though that's the only thing anyone knows about her. She doesn't have a box. It's a mistranslation
Mm-hmm.
by Erasmus, the Dutch polymath, who is translating Hesiod. I think he's translating Works and Days, because the version of Pandora in Theogony doesn't have any receptacle at all.
Right.
And in ancient artworks, visual artworks, there's no image of Pandora with any kind of receptacle either. She's only ever shown in the act of being created, being sculpted from the clay of the earth, because that's her primary role to the ancient Greeks, is she's our ancestor. Women are descended from Pandora, men are descended from Erichthonius. They're both chthonic, they're both made out of clay, out of the earth. But we're literally two different races, men and women, according to the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what, in ancient Greece, is important about Pandora. The receptacle, the jar, is only in Hesiod's second version of her story. And when Erasmus comes to translate it, he takes the Greek word pithos and he translates it to the Latin word pyxis, which means box. And the thing is that a Greek jar, as I'm sure you know, if you see them in museums in Greece or in Italy, they're usually wired to the stand or to the ground, because they're incredibly easy to knock over, and they have a lot of earthquakes in Greece and in Italy. They're very narrow at the base, very fat at the top, so they're really hard to keep upright. They're heavy and fragile, a lose-lose combination. It's like, this is the last kind of receptacle that you want to put all the world's evils in. Although, at this point, I feel compelled to point out that in Theognis's Elegies, the jar is full of nice things, not full of bad things. And we only know the story where Pandora willfully and miserably and deliberately opens a box. But actually, for Aesop, for example, of Fables fame, her husband Epimetheus opens the jar. And so he's the one who's responsible for letting everything out into the world. So Erasmus comes along and he sees the word pithos, translates it to pyxis. Her jar becomes a box. Within about 30 years, you start seeing paintings of her. And it suddenly, before that, she's been shown in a kind of Eve-ish light. The story of Eve from the Old Testament has been mapped over Pandora quite successfully. So you can say woman responsible for all bad things, which, is always a huge opportunity for an awful lot of people. And then, really quickly, she's got this, it becomes a sort of strong box that's got straps on it. This is real malice aforethought now, to open this thing and let all these terrible things out. And it's all down to Erasmus mistranslating this one word, pithos, jar, into pyxis, box. And I should tell you, in case you think this is just a gendered issue, it really isn't. He is also responsible for another idiom that's gone wrong. When we say in English that somebody who's unusually blunt likes to call a spade, that phrase comes from Erasmus, because in Greek, the word scaphe, which he translates as spade, actually means a hollowed out vessel, like a canoe. So we should say that somebody who's really blunt likes to call a canoe, but because of Erasmus, we don't.
That's interesting.
Isn't it, though?
What a troublesome guy.
I
My
know,
God.
it's all very well being the most celebrated Dutch polymath who ever lived, but honestly,
God.
would a dictionary have heard? That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, the jar, of course, is definitely something that I remembered from my reading so long ago in my bachelor's. That's like the number one thing I've always remembered about Pandora. My episode on her is just called Pandora Had a Jar. It was really interesting to me reading that chapter and hearing all the different examples of the way that she has been turned into this very manipulative and deceitful character over time.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How much misogyny is present in her retellings, because Helen gets a pretty rough go in the ancient world as well as in the later
absolutely
world. So that, I guess, you can acknowledge. But Pandora really does suffer the most incredible fall from grace, because Hesiod is shirty about her, but Hesiod is shirty about everything. He's just a grump.
Yeah.
He's grumpy about his brother. He's grumpy about women. And any kind of story where he can be cross about brothers and women is his absolute best day ever. And so the story of Pandora being dropped off with Epimetheus, brother, hapless brackets, of Prometheus, is like pay dirt for him. He can't believe his luck. He can say everything's a woman's fault and a hapless brother's fault. It's perfect. But, for the ancients, she's an agent of change. Zeus has decided that change has to come. And, Pandora is that agent. The idea of her being evil is really not, she's called Kalon Kakon by Hesiod, which is always translated as a beautiful evil. But of course, as the Greekists listening will know, both of those words can be visual or moral, and there's absolutely no indication as to which it is. Is she a beautiful evil or an ugly good? We're told that she's beautiful because she's created by Hephaestus and dressed and made beautiful by other gods and goddesses. But why would we assume that why can't she be beautiful ugly rather than beautiful evil? Why does it have to be her morals that are evil as opposed to something about her? The French have a phrase, jolie laide, which means beautiful ugly. Why can't Hesiod have coined that first? We just want her to be bad because she's a woman.
As if that's not something that happens all the time too with
all
of these things. But I mean, it's especially dangerous or, long lasting that the first woman got to be told that way,
because Hesiod says that after Pandora arrives, the sort of carefree age of man is at an end, but the carefree age of man has been brought to an end actually by Prometheus stealing fire. So these two huge shifts happen one on top of the other, and Zeus sends Pandora to us as an exchange for fire having been stolen. But these, it just is true that the human race evolved an enormous amount when fire was discovered. Mm-hmm. So that's really not a mistake. It's a really good mythic retelling of what actually happened in history. Is everything changes when we discover fire. And the Greek version of that is when Prometheus steals it from the gods and gives it to us. And so everything changes, and then Pandora comes along and everything changes all the more. She's the agent of change after Prometheus has sort of started everything rolling. It's like, well, that sounds okay. The carefree age of men is at an end, but does the carefree age of men sound great? What am I eating in the carefree age of men if I can't cook anything because we haven't got fire? I'm not sure I'm all here for the carefree age of men. That sounds like, what? Am I just going to gnaw on the leg of something? It
doesn't sound carefree. No, yeah, it doesn't sound carefree. No.
It sounds like poor dentistry is going to happen for nothing else. I'm not here for it at all.
Well, and it's so tough when, some of the earliest versions of so many of the stories we have come from a guy who was particularly prone to being angry with women and brothers, like you say. I mean, Hesiod gives us so many of the first versions of myths, but he was by no means not biased.
No, I mean, he's an incredibly biased source, which doesn't for a minute make him less valuable or less interesting, but it does mean you have to read him with a slightly critical eyebrow, and at least look at some other options.
He's so important, but one of the things I remember most from my mythology prof in my undergrad was her just casually mentioning how much he hated women.
Yes, I mean, yeah. I mean,
problematic statement or a bit harsh, maybe.
I mean, I think that's probably. I don't think it's wildly inaccurate. It's really difficult, isn't it, with writers who sort of predate our values to identify how much they do or don't coincide with those values, because like, well, the traditional question presented to students here is Euripides misogynist or feminist? It's like, well, that's a little bit like saying Euripides, space travel or scuba diving. They're after him. So in lots of ways, it doesn't really, it doesn't apply. I think he's one of the great feminist writers of all time. But of course, that's not a description that he would have recognized. So, it's not a kind of legitimate way in lots of ways of describing him. Just because that's how I interpret him doesn't mean it's remotely reasonable to expect him to fulfill my criteria of what feminism is. Of course it's not.
No, and I mean, I think, well, just to get into Euripides then, but I absolutely love his take on the women, but I think it's less about feminism and more about him just giving them a voice. So I think we really often take it or really connect with it because he just gives women a personality in a way that doesn't exist a lot.
Yeah, Edith Hall made the argument, which I find really hard to dispute in any way, that he must have had an incredible actor who he worked with a lot, who could just do women brilliantly, because it can't possibly be an accident that there are so many of these incredible female roles in Euripides. Was he just fascinated by women's inner lives? Sure, he must have been, or he couldn't have written it. But it's a good, strong argument, isn't it, that he's just this writer who's got this incredible actor who can really nail it. And you go, well, yeah, I guess you would then. You just keep doing it.
I love that idea that's what he was working with too. Yeah. I mean, I just love his women. His Medea makes me happier than anything.
It is the bomb.
It's just wonderful.
Is the absolute bomb.
Yeah. It just makes you love her in a way that you love Clytemnestra, and neither of them are particularly lovable.
Yeah, but that's great writing for you. That's exactly what it looks like. You know, that bit where people always kind of worry about whether a character is sympathetic. It's like, honesty couldn't matter less. Are they sympathetic? No. Do I want to know what happens next? Yeah. I really do.
Do I want to maybe have a conversation with them at a fair enough distance? Yes.
yeah, you know, a few meters out of Axe's reach, let's say.
Exactly. Or poisonous cloaks.
Yes, don't necessarily open that box. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is good advice for us all.
Thank you so much for speaking with me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Nerds, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you loved every minute of this conversation just like I did. I really can't express how exciting this was and how much I learned. We spoke back in November, but I edited it recently, and the episode just made me so happy again. For reference to the plays we were referring to at the top of the episode were the 15 Heroines series that were put on by the Jermyn Street Theatre in London back in November. They were retellings of Ovid's Heroides. They were utterly beautiful. The books of Natalie Haynes that are referenced are 1,000 Ships, which is out soon, I think next week, in North America, and it's already available in the UK and probably elsewhere. Pandora's Jar is out eventually in North America, but it is available in the UK and again, probably elsewhere. The Children of Jocasta is available everywhere, as far as I know, and all of this will be in the episode description should you need to refer back. Thank you all so much. Perhaps this is the time for a rating and a review. Give it a think. I am Liv, and I love this shit.
Experience gorgeous, lasting, high-quality hair color with Madison Reed. Find your perfect shade at madison-reed.com and get 10% off plus free shipping on your first color kit. Use code RADIO10.